Welcome to Underhive Workshop. This is Goblin King. First off, I want to apologize about the fact that it's been about a month, 2 months, since we were last on. Been a couple of upgrades. You guys will notice that there's a lot more height on the camera. We got a new camera up there. Had a couple of issues with the computer we record on. That's all nice and set. And then I had a couple of upgrades that I did to the microphone. Also had a couple of tool upgrades, which you guys will see a few of today. I'll be using my Proxxon hot wire cutter to cut bricks for the build, and I might be using a couple of other little tools that I have around that you haven't seen before, just to kind of illustrate other tools that you can keep in your tool belt, other things that you can use in the hobby and in the space of building terrain. So our goal today is to create basically a replica of the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle tower. And obviously this was a plastic kit that was sold by GW, and I'm not going to be building it exact. I'm just kind of using pictures of it as reference to come up with a plan. But these are very handy. They're very awesome. You know, you build 3 or 4 of them, or even 1 or 2 of them, and then you can use them on a Mordheim table, or even on your Age of Sigmar table, or get ready for the return of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Really kind of up to you guys. You'll see as I'm going through kind of sketching out the concept and showing you the finished product. And I did record this entire video on the old camera, but what ended up happening was I kept getting kind of this shot over and over and over again, which is really hard to see. Now I can actually show you guys a lot more detail. There's all the detail that I did to the door and a bunch of other things. Like our other terrain tutorial projects, I will be building it today, and we will be coming back to paint it in a future episode. Still trying to figure out how to get these episodes a little bit faster, a little bit nicer for you guys, so they're not, 45 minutes to an hour long, but bear with me as I kind of figure out the format. So the first things that I want to go over are the tools that we are going to be using today for the build. As always, we're going to be using a carpenter's square or a L ruler, 90-degree ruler. Couple of different names that people use for them, but they're carpenter squares. You can pick them up at your hardware store. You might even be able to find them on Amazon really easily. Usually I try to throw a couple of links down in the description of the video so you can see the tools I'm using. I'll be using a pencil, possibly a Sharpie. Because the material I use is black, it's really easy to fix my mistakes using a Sharpie. A white pen, which helps my lines stand out on camera. Hobby knife, utility knife. I prefer utility knives in a lot of cases, but sometimes I got to jump down to the hobby knife to do some detail cut work. I'll be using a wire brush to do some detailing, and then I will be using a miter saw and a miter saw holder. And this is something that I can align different materials in, and then I can use the saw to really precisely get the cuts that I want to. Oh, and one tool I forgot about, we'll be using a rolled up tin foil ball later to do some texturing on the XPS foam. We'll also be using some various glues today. We'll be using a tacky white PVA glue, and we will be using a glue gun for some of the assembly. So as far as materials go for today, we will be using some poster board. I prefer a product called Gator board that's just a little bit thicker than some others. We'll also be using some chipboard. I usually rely on these recycled cardboard packaging food containers because I think they're a great source. We'll be using balsa wood dowels, balsa wood square dowels. I have a couple of different sizes. I'll be using this 5mm by 5mm size and this 3mm or 2mm and 2.5mm by 2.5mm size for some detail work. Popsicle sticks, as always, because they'll be used for various different little tiny bits of detail. I'm also going to be using some plastic card later on, and I'll show that when I detail out the door. And I might use some brass rod as I did in the original build because it gives me that little door handle that I really liked. And then I'll be using some XPS foam. Now there's a couple of other specialized tools that I'll be using, and there's a couple of other materials I'll be using. The other big material to kind of have in mind right before we jump into everything is playground sands. I have this playground sand in a shoebox sized Tupperware, one of these Sterilite things. It's just a 20 pound bag of playground sand that I got off of Amazon. Makes a very, very good texture. And cover everything in PVA where you want texture to be, sprinkle it on. You can also mix it with PVA if you want a paintable paste or something like that. If you're trying to go for more of a grout look, we'll sprinkle it on. So as far as specialized tools go today, I've shown you guys how to cut XPS foam by hand. You definitely can still do it. However, I'm going to switch to using my Proxxon wire cutter. All right, so on to the cut list we'll need. We'll be cutting out all of the pieces in this plan right here. I'll pop up a steady larger image of this for you guys, or maybe just try to get a little bit closer to camera. There you go. There's your close-up. But we're going to cut out of our gator board all of these pieces. The first thing that we're going to need is we're going to need 4 5-inch by 7 1/4 inch pieces. Then we're going to need 1 5-inch by 5-inch piece. So that would build all of these walls, our front, our back, and our side walls. That 5-inch is not going to go on the bottom. As you see, the bottom of this is actually hollow. It'll go at the top. It'll just go to hold everything in place at the top so we know where the top is. Then for the topper itself, with the battlements and all that's extra detail, we're going to cut 4 3 3/4 inch by 6-inch rectangles. Those would be these guys up here. And then we are going to cut 1 6-inch by 6-inch square piece, which will be the base that these tiles eventually go on. And that'll give us a nice base to build our little battlement set here. All the other little cuts that we're going to make, everything like that, will be measured on the fly. When I get into doing the details for things like these edge pieces that I've built in and everything like that, I kind of either measure by eye or I take a measurement as needed. Those are the major cuts. My overall workflow as I go through this is I'm going to mark out all of my cuts on my gator board. Then I'm going to go ahead and cut all of my basic pieces out. So that's going to be my 4 foundation pieces, the topper, and then the 4 battlement pieces and the base for the battlement. I'm going to get those all cut out, set aside. I'm then going to move over to the Proxxon hot wire cutting table. I'm going to cut all of my bricks. I'm going to toss all of my bricks into Tupperware so I can shake them up and get some nice texture on them. And then I'm going to come back. I'm going to do all of my basic assembly along with getting some of the starting details done, like laying in the door, the foundation of the door. Then I'm going to apply all of my XPS foam, and then I'm going to start laying in various details. As we hit each step, I'll take a minute to stop and kind of talk about the process that I'm going to do so you can get an idea of what tools I'm using in which cases to kind of make this process go a little bit faster and a little bit better as far as my workflow goes. All right, so let's go over all of the notation that I laid out on just one side. So the side that I laid out is the side that is going to have the door in it. As you can see from my original plan, the door is to be 1.25 inches by 2 inches tall. It's generally the door size that I use for Mordheim and Fantasy Battle stuff. I went ahead and on the top of the 2-inch added a little bit of a detail. You can build this into your 2-inch. You could add it on top. It's really up to you. The important measurements that I made are I measured 1 inch from the bottom. So I will be applying this chipboard to that inch from the bottom, which will give me a little bit of a base. So some of the lower bricks will actually stand out further from the base. Just a little bit. It gives a hint. It's not super important. It just gives a little bit of a hint of different texture and different variation. So I'll line the bottoms with 1 inch in chipboard as I start building. Then I found the center point, which on 5 inches is going to be 2.5 inches in. I went ahead and drew my center line all the way up, measured 2 inches up to get the base of my door, drew a construction line, went ahead and filled it in a little bit more, measured 5/8 of an inch out from that center line. That gives me a total door length of 1.25 inches when it's all laid out. Went ahead and sketched the rest of it in. The other things that I've got measured here are at 3 3/4 or 2 3/4 from the 1 inch line is going to be my first 2.5 millimeter edge piece, which is going to give me a little bit again of texture and variation. So it's not just flat. And then 1.5 inches above that, there is going to be the second one. So on the bottom one, it is going to be on the top, and on the top one, it's going to be on the bottom, aligned to the bottom of the line, if you want to say the insides, so to speak. So with all of that laid out, I can now cut out this door and start on the door detail. But before we jump into that, let's talk about cutting this balsa wood, add trim, if you will, to the box to give it a little bit of variation and a little bit of change so it doesn't necessarily look super boring. So the easy way to do that is to take one of these guys, measure out that 7 3/4 length that you need. We'll mark it in black pencil this time just because it'll stand out a little bit better again on camera. Nice and marked out where I need it. Then I'm going to lay it right here into my miter. I'm going to line it up with that central line that I need. Then I'm going to take the other 4. I'm going to also lay them out. Make sure they're nice and lined up. You can, if you want to, and I've done this before, tape them all together with painter's tape just to hold them a little bit more. And then I'm just going to slide my saw in here, and I'm going to use the miter guard to saw through the length that I need. Really, really quick, really, really easy. There are my 4 7 3/4 inch guys ready to go. I can set them aside with the other pre-cut pieces I have. And then I've got this scrap, which is going to be useful at some point. So it's actually going to go up there into this other project. If you're wondering what this project is, this is actually, we're going to take a break from doing the Mordheim and then the city fight because I got a commission to do a couple of tables at a local event. So I'm going to do some Mad Max rocky terrain tables to just give kind of a different outlook on stuff. So just a little bit of a tease. I'll actually be going a lot deeper into the WTC rules, the old 7th, 8th edition WTC table setup rules. I have kind of my own expanded version that I do just because we're trying to work a little bit more narrative into that stuff. But that'll be the next project. That'll probably be my first mega build. But that is the power and the beauty of these guys. It gets you that really quick, easy cut. Of course, you can do it. Same thing with popsicle sticks. If you needed to cut a popsicle stick to the right length, or say you've got some brass rod that's hollow or some plastic rod that's hollow, again, you could load it up in here. You could cut it and you could get that really nice flat straight edge. But one of the problems a lot of us have in the hobby world is that when, even with this lighter material, it's super easy to cut with stuff. It's really hard to get that straight edge, that straight cut edge. Now, the other thing that you can do with these, now that they're ready, is before they're glued in place, just to give them a little bit of texture, you can take a wire brush and you can basically just run up and down them. You're going to gouge up that soft balsa wood just a little bit. You're going to give a little bit of a fake wood grain. And obviously it's already got wood grain because it's wood, but you're just going to remove a little bit of the softer material. You're going to leave behind the harder material of the wood itself. When you go into the painting process, whether or not you're inking it or whether or not you're dry brushing it or whether or not you're applying like a wash or a contrast or something like that, all of those little grooves are going to stand out really, really well. So this is just something that you can experiment with, and you should probably be able to see as the autofocus there gets in that there's just a little bit of texture worked in. Just pops it a little bit. You can do it. You don't have to do it. Kind of up to you. Some people prefer to leave them completely untextured because then you can make them whatever material you want when you paint them, so they don't necessarily have to be wood. They could be something else, but it just gives that little bit extra. You can see how much wood I'm removing with just the sawdust that's built up through the process. The other layout I'm going to do now is I'm going to mark in my battlement cuts. And the way that I do this is I always start from one side. So I'm going to lay out every inch, which is going to give me 5 divisions all the way across. And then I'm going to measure an inch up, and I'm going to measure 1/8 of an inch to the right each time. And that's going to give me a little chunk that I can cut out. And if I set it up on all of them so that each time I'm going the same direction, when I glue them, as long as I glue them in the proper order with the numbers facing outward, because that's the way that I made the measurements, they'll offset in a way that you won't necessarily be able to tell that they're not straight aligned right across. There is a way, obviously. Lay out these 5 marks. You're going to do 1/8 of an inch. So you're going to measure 1/16 of an inch on each side, and they're going to be perfectly centered and all of that stuff. However, it just doesn't make a huge amount of difference when the final product is done, in my mind, to go through that little bit of an extra. And as you can kind of see, they're not truly aligned. They're pretty close. It's one of those things. As soon as models and minis and paint are on there, it's going to be really hard to tell that these aren't necessarily 100% level and straight across. You can see that little bit of variation, but I kind of like that. I kind of want that. It works for me. I like the way it looks. It's never really bugged me. Obviously, in an injection molding process with like the original plastic, they weren't going to go ahead and do it that way. They were going to do it differently. And if you're getting any of the newer terrain that's there off the shelf, again, you're kind of hitting into that. Everything's kind of been 3D modeled and 3D printed, so everything can be down to the micron and perfect. And just not really what I want to go for with this build. I want to get that little bit of variation. I want to get a little bit of that people that live in this area, people who live in Mordheim, built this by hand over generations. Maybe the top wasn't even added when the original building was constructed. You kind of tell that a little bit of that story as the process goes along, and not really rely on like, well, everything's perfect and everything's 100% level, because nothing in our modern world is perfectly level. Nothing in the ancient world is perfectly level. There's some really cool stuff out there, but all the ancient alien stuff, none of those lines are as straight or as perfect or as laid out as well as the TV shows might have you believing. People made this stuff by hand, and there's tiny imperfections and there's tiny variations, and it's really cool to just see how it's made and how it looks, and it gives it so much character and depth. So I'm going to do the same process here. The other thing that I'm going to do is, as soon as I've popped this door out, I'm going to cut my popsicle sticks, and I'm going to glue my popsicle sticks from the opposite side to give my door texture. If I wanted to take that extra time to add a little bit extra texture, I take my wire brush and I rub it on my popsicle stick. It's going to gouge up the wood. It's also going to kind of target and tear out and texture out. And that way, when I go to the paint process, I'm using the texture of the material to work in my favor to sell that it's wood. I'm using wood. I'm going to obviously prime everything. It's going to end up black. Undercoat with a zenithal in gray. And then I'm going to paint over that, which is going to kind of very, very quickly and very, very rapidly change whatever the original wood color, wood grain even was. So I'm going to have to paint a lot of that back in. And if I can go ahead and add grain, add grooves, add texture before I get to that process, I'm better off. So in order to make the door, I'm going to take these popsicle sticks, I'm going to lop off one end, and then I'm going to measure out 3 inches. I'm going to cut off the other end, and then I'm going to take these pieces and I'm going to split them in half. And to do all of this, I'm using another tool, the Midwest Products Easy Cutter. Very, very cool product. If you can find it, it cuts at a variety of different angles and all that. Once these pieces are split, I'm going to flip over my facade, my front face there. You'll notice that I'm referring to the unmarked side as the back side. That's just something that I do so I have an idea of what the front and the back is. I want this door to be inset, so it's important to glue it on what's going to be the back side. It's also going to cut down. I don't have to shape all of this wood. So once all of those are glued in, I'm going to glue another couple of 2-inch pieces behind it just because there is a little bit of gapping that you can see. Just gives that little bit of extra detail, that little bit extra pop, texture, all of that stuff. Then I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to look at the front, and then I'm going to take my wire brush one more time to just kind of get some texture in, just get a little bit more texture in if I can. It's also going to help me knock out any of that extra hot glue that did get in there. Now, you don't have to use hot glue. I know a lot of people choose to use PVA glue or maybe even super glue when they're laying this stuff out. I just like hot glue. I like the utility. It's my chosen material for this, chosen adhesive for this sort of work. With the wire brush, I'm always going to go up and down, top to bottom, because if I go side to side, I'm kind of defeating the purpose. I'm adding texture where I don't need it unless I want to really get some chips and dings into the door. But again, it gets that nice little look. It's already set. It's a little trick to make a door really quickly. You can even take a sanding stick if you want and go in and use it to bevel the edges by just sanding the edges of the gator board or your poster board down a little bit. In this particular case, I'm just sort of giving it a subtle, soft edge. Not really that big of a detail. I could spend a little bit more time getting it to like a 45-degree angle, or I could even go in with like a Dremel and make it a lot more extreme. But in this case, I just want to give it a little bit of a softness to the edge, just make it look a little bit more like the door's inset and not necessarily set back like it's a separate surface. So that's the first major little portion of the build done, getting that door inset. It's kind of the first big piece of detail. The next piece of detail is going to be the brickwork. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut out those 1-inch bases that I need. I'm going to apply them to all of the sides, and then I'm going to flip on over to my Proxen hot wire table so I can cut out a bunch of bricks. Okay, so now that I have all of my bricks cut out, I'm ready to texture them a little bit, shake them a little bit, and I shake them for about a minute, minute and a half. Obviously not something that you guys want to watch happen. Throw a couple pieces of rock in there. There are actually some pieces of concrete that I broke up from my backyard from a big slab that I used to have, and they're great because they've got a lot of little sharp edges and all of that, and they also kind of break apart and form even tinier rocks every once in a while. So I just shake the shit out of those for a little bit, gets a little bit of texture all over. Set that aside. I'm going to come over and do all of my main assembly. You may have noticed that I also went ahead and cut out my steps. Just something that I kind of eyeballed and used used calipers to figure out my millimeter length. I showed the millimeter. I did 5mm by 5mm by 12mm bricks. And then everything else I did, including everything else I cut, including the steps and the bricks I'm going to put on top, was a little bit more eyeballed, just with the construction lines that are on the Proxen hot table itself. I want to say they're 1/2 inch increments, but I could be wrong. They might be closer to 1/4 inch, but they're somewhere in there. They could be 5/8. They could be millimeters. I'm not 100% sure. I have not taken my calipers to it and figured out all of the actual lengths. But yeah, with all of those set aside and getting damaged, I'm going to move on over here and do all of my basic assembly. I'm going to take these 5mm by 5mm balsa wood sticks that I had already kind of roughed up a little bit with my wire brush, and I'm going to glue them onto each side of the face. What this is going to do is it's going to give me kind of a little bit of an offset, as you can see as I'm gluing them together here. It also allows me to align them pretty well, and if there's any little tiny imperfections with how I glued the gator board together, this is going to give me, or how I cut the gator board, excuse me, this is going to give me an ability to kind of fix that by just putting a little bit extra hot glue in there. Once I've got both sides done, I go ahead and assemble the back wall and the front wall and slap everything together. I'm going to take these stairs. Glue the stairs together, cut a little bit of a notch for that 1-inch chipboard barrier that I put on the bottom and put it there. One of the things you may have noticed as I'm assembling this guy, or as I was assembling that guy, I actually cut my 5mm by 5mm balsa wood the wrong size, so I got to get rid of about a 1/2 inch. I did 7 3/4 instead of 7 1/4. It's even written right there on the thing. So every once in a while, the measure once, cut twice doesn't so much work out. Yeah, so once that's done, I take the 6-inch by 6-inch, again, going back to that 5mm balsa wood. I'm gluing it on all of the sides, which gives me a little bit of a push. once that's all glued up, I can actually fit the base into the top. So at this point, if I was doing something a little bit more off the wall or a little bit more crazy, or however you want to put it, I could, put some magnets in here, make this magnetic, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to hot glue it together. The hot glue in the corners, a little bit of hot glue in the middle, and then I'm going to press that down. And then it's all about getting those battlements in place, gluing them. They're 6 inches long, so they're going to sit right on that face. And then I'm going to be able to use the 5mm cast off that I have here set aside to build up those little edges again. Again, it just kind of gives an overall shape to it. It gives a little bit of texture as I continue the build. Once everything's done and fitted, I take my sanding stick to a couple of things, just kind of smooth out some of those top edges, make sure that everything kind of fits a little bit better, and I get this basic build. Stairs are in place, the body is in place, I've got this extra detail up on top already. I can come back in with my wire brush and just damage up all of this balsa wood a little bit more. Again, kind of going with the grain on whatever it is. On these, the ones that I glued sideways, instead of going up and down, I'm actually going to go sideways. Because again, these beams would have been cut from a tree, milled out and fit. Just going to make sure that everything kind of has a little bit of texture. Damage it up just a tad and get it ready for the brick laying process. But realistically, if you are going for the simpler version, or you just need to get something out on table, this is pretty close to done. There's a couple of things of detail that obviously I would add, but this is the point in the builds where everything really becomes detail work. The body is done. You could do whatever you wanted at this point. If you wanted to lay down pieces of XPS that were just kind of cut to shape and use a pen to dig in lines, you could do that. Or if you wanted to use a 3D printed texture, maybe some like polymer clay or even green stuff or milliput, and then press a texture into it, you could do that. It really is entirely up to you at this point if you wanted to kind of move away from what I'm doing with the tutorial. But what I'm going to do is obviously add a bunch of bricks. I'm going to do it brick by brick because that's just the way I roll. Well, the rest of the workflow really kind of comes down to getting details in. One of the things that I'm going to do, one of the things that I've actually noticed a couple of the other terrain guys here does, I believe Dice and Devs also does this, is I'm going to actually use hot glue just to establish my base of bricks all the way around. And then I'll use PVA glue for the others. That just, it makes sure that that bottom line is going to be held in. I'm also going to have to do something with the steps. I cut the steps a little bit thinner than I meant to. I had meant to cut them to be 1 1/4 all the way across, but as you can kind of see, they're a little bit thinner. Let's see if I can get a good angle. They're a little bit thinner than the doorway, but I don't necessarily mind that because it'll allow me to do some interesting things. So I'll probably take a couple measurements, go back to the prox and hot cut table at a certain point to make that little extra piece. But yeah, here we are. We're in the detail stage. This is the stage where you get to kind of start telling a little bit of a story. One of the things that I had done with the original that I'm probably going to do with this one as well is I had built up some more details around the edge with just some of this scrap wood. And then I had even gone in and put some supports down, older towers. You know, if you go on Google and you look at older towers and stuff that you can find, a lot of times they had these little supports that came down. And if I had the right type of 3D printed bits, which I don't, if I had some maybe like 3D printed gargoyles or something, I could obviously add those. So this is really the fun part. This is the storytelling part, and the story that I'm going to tell is building a brick Mordheim tower, and then I will have 2 for my table, which means that the only thing left I've got to do for tower tutorials is we need to do a ruined one, and then I would like to do a really cool kind of big centerpiece wizard tower, something really twisted, something Castlevania looking. right, so a little bit of a montage as I go around putting all the bricks on. I ended up deciding to not do the PVA glue. It's normally what I do. I normally line with the hot glue, and then I switch to the PVA glue for all the different bricks. But I was kind of on a roll, and I kind of liked what I was doing. I was kind of just feeling the experience, so I went with it. As you can see, or as I mentioned earlier, a lot comes down to just different little storytelling techniques and what you want to do. As I laid out the support beams on the middle, decided I didn't quite like them, ripped them off. I went back and forth between laying out the bricks on the side and laying out the bricks on the top. I decided to add a trapdoor to the top, just sort of using little measurements to figure out what I wanted to do. I used D&D rules, so if you occupy a 1-inch square, and my cutting mat is 1 inch by 1 inch squares, basically, there you go, trapdoor is a 1 inch square. So I built in a little trapdoor, went ahead and laid in the entire roof, and then just kept kind of moving around the build, adding little details here and there. It's a little different than the other one I built, and that's okay. I kind of like the idea that it's a standard construction form, but it's not necessarily a standard construct or a standard template, if you will. That's more of a 40K thing, right? Standard template constructs there. I added little front posts to the front of the staircase. The idea that I think I have there is at some point to maybe either put some candles or something on top of them, or maybe build little lanterns. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe I'll try to find something 3D print. Decided to add these little overhang pieces on the roof or underneath the battlements of the roof. Again, just something that I could hang somebody off of, or hang skeletons or bodies or something off of in the future. Just kind of giving myself something to play with. Getting down and finishing up, it's just lots of little detail work. Laying in the bricks is definitely kind of a cathartic experience. You can kind of zen out and listen to your favorite podcasts, like Under the Hive of Madness, our podcast, new episodes every Wednesday. But it just gives you that little bit, you know. I love doing it. I love the way it looks, so it's definitely worth it. And at the end of the day, even if it takes a little bit longer, I get an end product that I think looks really good. So the last thing that I do after everything is built is I'm going to take my tinfoil ball and I'm going to kind of roughly roll it over mostly edges, anything that might seem that it needs a little bit more texture. Even though I shook them up already, I'm just going to kind of go in and try to put in a little bit more texture. One of the places to definitely do it on, because I didn't get a chance to do it, would be the staircase. The staircase didn't get textured at all. But, you know, be a little careful, especially when you're going to put a bunch of weight on finished surfaces. You don't want to cut or rip off bricks. You also notice as I laid the bricks in on the corners, I did kind of an open brick pattern, and that's just to, this is one of those things that I know it doesn't necessarily look, or it doesn't necessarily make sense from a structural standpoint. You wouldn't just brick the corners, but I am going to go in and texture everything so it looks like concrete or stucco or masonry or something is in the build. So it will make sense when it's done. It's just a little extra cool detail. I always liked that. And, you know, the corners of towers, but looking a little bit more robust. The one downside to using hot glue is every once in a while you get little areas that build up and you have to clean them. And it would be a reason not to do it. Usually I spend a couple of minutes right before I paint, after it's had a couple of days to sit, just sort of pulling off all the little cobwebs and cleaning up anything that looks out of sorts. It also does give you sometimes kind of a cool little place, though, to start if you wanted to do anything like water damage, or if you maybe wanted to do vines. So that's something to think about. Adhesives, you know, how you build is going to kind of depend on the workflow that you want to do at the time that you want to do it. I had just gotten to a groove and wanted to keep running with the tools that I was working with. I didn't want to get out and kind of do the process of doing one part and then waiting, and then doing one part and then waiting, and then doing one part and waiting. I kind of wanted to move and evolve and watch it change and kind of tell the story as I was moving. So that was pretty much the reason that I forged ahead there. But as you can see, just kind of going in, cleaning it up, using the tin foil to add a little bit of texture here or there. So the last step is to add some grit, to add some sand, to add some bigger grit into the builds. Make sure that there's just all of that lovely texture that I'm going to want later on when I paint. I'm, you know, taking that tin foil into any places that feel like they're missing it. This is kind of that, not necessarily that last chance. I kind of have as you've seen with some of the other builds I've done, I kind of have a layer it all, let it sort itself out later approach to a lot of this stuff. This is where I would figure out all my texture, lay in all my PVA glue, paint it where I think it's going to need to go, and then start with a couple of different grades of grit. Like normal, the majority of the bigger stuff I'm going to use is going to be a crushed coral. And then when I'm done with the crushed coral, I'm going to graduate to a couple of different sands. In this particular case, I'm going to coat a lot of the sides of the build with PVA glue, and then I'm going to kind of douse it in sand specifically because I want to give it a stucco or a concrete look. And when I do that, I'm going to pay particular attention to painting into those little brick grooves that I've left, those little brick gaps that I've left to kind of tell that story and bridge how that material is handled. So I'll go in and do my crushed coral first on the roof, and then I'll go along each side, adding the detail that I want with sand. All right, so the last little bit to do is detailing. So on the original build that I had done, I added a piece of plastic card and some plastic card rivets and a handle with some brass rod. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing this time, although I will probably also detail out a little bit on this trapdoor. So plastic card is one of those things that you hear about a lot in the hobby. And until you find it, you pretty much don't know what people are talking about. Easy source of plastic card, or one of the easier sources of plastic card, are actually old gift cards from like Starbucks or any of those companies that have gift cards. You can do that. You can also find old signage, and these are old sales tags from a company I used to work for that I kept. You can also buy constructional plastic cards, stuff that's meant for this, stuff that's meant for building architectural scale models and stuff like that. That comes from a company called Evergreen Plastics. I have a bunch of that already. What I do is buy their bits and pieces lots. I'll have a link to one of those bits and pieces lots in the description, but it's just really handy to have into your toolbox. Once you've got it, you can do a bunch of different things with it. One of the things that I have done is I've taken a center punch, a hole punch basically for leather, that I had picked up at a thrift store, and I used it to cut out a bunch of little round rivets. They would be like belt holes or something for like belt. They kind of work when you're looking for like either rivets on, maybe an orc vehicle for 40k, or if you're wanting to put like here, just some little extra details to a wooden door. They're just kind of a perfect little accent piece. When I get little cast off pieces, little pieces of plastic card I'm not going to be able to use, something like this piece right here, I'll just poke a bunch of holes through it. So I've got a bunch of these rivets sitting around. I toss them into just a little case like this, and then I pull out what I need. Looks like that one's the wrong size. This is just a random box. I've got a bunch of different sizes in here. It looks like I may have used up all of my little ones on various projects. Oh, no, there's one right there. So yeah, it just one of those things. Those plastic, or not plastic, those metalworking, woodworking, leatherworking tools that just do lots of little punches are super helpful. This material is probably only 1.5 to maybe 2 millimeters thick. Can't be much more than that. So it's very, very thin material. Those should be good for what we're going to do. The next thing is brass rod. And brass rod, again, comes in a bunch of different thicknesses. And that piece is probably what we're going to use. One of those two pieces is probably what we're going to use. So in order to make a handle, or a pair of handles, I'm going to grab the brass rod at about the thickness I want, and then I am going to bend to get a handle shape. I'll just figure out where I want the thickness on the other side, and again, once I've got that shape, almost like making a staple. Once I have that shape that I like, I'll just have to trim off a little bit of the brass rod with some snips. For the roof, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to bend out that brass rod into a handle. This one's a little tighter, a little smaller. There we go. And I'll trim that up in a second. The last thing that I'll need is I'll need some steel banding for the door. So again, here's just another piece of plastic card. It's might be a little thick. Let's see real quick. No, that's actually about the right thickness. So I'll just mark it, cut it down, and prep it to glue right on there. To glue all these details on, I'm going to move over to a super glue, just because I'm gluing different materials now to each other, and I don't want all the extra mess of the hot glue. So I'll go ahead and get all that laid out. So in order to get these to seat a little bit better, I am going to use a pin vise to go ahead and make slightly deeper holes, actually drill into that wood a little bit. So this is the Wow Stick. They're really, really nice. It's a little powered pin vise, basically. Makes life really, really easy. Since this is a grimdark build, being something from the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and I specifically put these posts out front on the staircase because I wanted to do something a little bit different, a little bit extra with them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my tinfoil, I'm going to roll it on, I'm going to get some texture in on top of everything. Just taking a second little pass, just making it do what I want to. Then I am going to come in and look at all of these little candles that I had printed out for use and things like this, and I'm going to put some candles on these posts. So I'm going to grab a couple of these guys. Let's see what we got. I think we got some skulls with candles on top of them. I think that works really well. So I'm going to grab a couple of those, and then I've got a couple of candles that are just kind of alone. I got these little double clusters of candles, so I'll take one of those as well. I guess that's a little cluster of 3, so we'll take that guy. We'll put all these little candelabras and everything back. Obviously, they work for other purposes. Let's see what else we got in here. We got a couple of skulls, so I'll grab a couple of skulls. Nothing else really works. Everything else is kind of for the sci-fi world. So there's all my little 3D pieces. These are all 3D free Thingiverse prints that I did on my resin printer. Anything like this, any little details can just help spice stuff up. Always important to make sure that they're nice and prepped. Sometimes little defects, or in this case, supports might be still stuck to stuff. So I'm just going to clean them up if I can. If I find anything like that. Now also, I don't want to just glue them. I'll use this as an example. I don't necessarily want to just glue them directly to the top of the post. In certain cases that might look good, but when I'm trying to do a little bit of a pile of candles, give that idea that this is something that's used to light this, that isn't going to necessarily work as much. If I just wanted to do one of these skulls with a candle on top of it, maybe a lantern, it would work, but in this case, it's not going to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to my bricks, and I'm going to get out some of these flat ones that I cut for the top. I always cut extra bricks, by the way. They're a little bigger, you can see right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically mock out what I think is going to work by placing this in the center, kind of figuring out how much smaller I want it to be. No, actually, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these in half, and then I'm going to just cut them in half a second time. Cutting mats are awesome because you don't always have to go back to your ruler, especially if you got marks on your cutting mat. And there we go. That's actually pretty good. I like that quite a bit. Oh, I put a little dab on and show you guys up close. So it gives just a little bit of an overhang. Just a little bit of detail. So I'm going to go ahead and glue those to each of these post tops. Very, very carefully, I'm going to take my tin foil and just roughen up the edges, basically making sure to put back pressure on it. I don't want to snap off the piece, and I don't want to damage it too much, too greatly. And then I'm just going to glue on my little tiny details with some hot glue. That worked out really well. I like that little overhang. I was able to add a skull to each little one. There's my little entryway with its little extra details. Got some candles on the steps, some candles on the posts. Could always add more candles if I wanted to, make it look a little bit like a shrine had been built. But I kind of like this whole idea that they're having to use their rush lights because their lanterns were stolen or something like that. Now, I do have this last little candle that I pulled out, so we might as well add it. Just to sell that narrative a little bit more. That'll wrap it up for this build of the Underhive Workshop. Go ahead and taking a look at making one of those medieval plastic castles that used to be in the 2nd and 3rd edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle range. We will be back in a couple of weeks with some videos on my progress on the Mad Max desert terrain for a couple of tables here in local tournament scenes. So if that's something that's going to interest you, you want to see kind of how I build that, go ahead and give us a like and subscribe. Check out the other videos, and if you need something to listen to while you're hobbying, check out our podcast under the Hive of Madness. Thank you, and have a great day.